Welcome to Global Optimum, the podcast dedicated to making you a more effective altruist. I am Daniel Gambacorda. We are going to start off today with a groaner. What did the effective altruist get for Christmas? They got a doing good sweater. All right. You're probably done laughing by this point, so I'll move on. This episode will feature the following segments. Apply psychology, in which I'll talk about the modularity of the mind. Expertise, in which I'll go into some ways to improve your public speaking. And finally, check this rec, in which I'll provide you with a recommendation of a book, article, podcast that perhaps you are not familiar with. Let's get into it. I'm going to talk about a very general principle in psychology. Eventually, I'm going to draw on this principle to come up with actionable advice, things you can do to improve yourself. But I'm going to first spend a bit of time explaining the principle, so the actual application will have to wait until the next episode. The principle I will talk about is modularity. The mind is modular. This means that the mind is made up of many parts specialized for particular functions. The parts are referred to as modules. Modules are information processing devices. They take in some narrow set of inputs. They do something. They perform some task. Within your brain are many modules doing many different particular jobs, becoming more or less active as the situation calls for it. I'm going to first talk about a couple of very straightforward examples that demonstrate that the mind is made up of specific parts that do particular things. There are examples where we can localize brain function. We can point to a chunk of brain and say, that chunk does this. That chunk performs such and such function. Of course, a lot of what the brain does is going to be distributed across different parts of the brain, but there are nonetheless examples of pretty significant localization. For example, Broca's area is a brain region in the frontal lobe, usually on the left. Broca's area is involved in speech production. Damage to Broca's area can result in a condition known as Broca's aphasia, which is characterized by an inability to produce fluent speech. Typically, someone with Broca's aphasia can understand speech, but has trouble producing it themselves. There's another brain region, also usually in the left hemisphere, known as Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is responsible for speech comprehension. Damage to Wernicke's area can lead to Wernicke's aphasia, which is characterized by difficulty understanding speech. Someone with Wernicke's aphasia typically can produce speech. They can speak in grammatically correct sentences, though what they are saying isn't always coherent. So here we have an example of two regions of the brain with specific jobs. You damage Broca's area, and you can understand speech, but you have trouble producing it. You damage Wernicke's area, and you can produce speech, but you have trouble understanding it. So these are parts of the brain that have specific functions. I use examples of localized brain function because they are easy, but I emphasize that for much of what we do, there's many parts of the brain involved, and be way too oversimplified to say that we can match up everything a person does with one particular chunk of brain. When we're talking about modules, we're just talking about some specialized mechanism. There are parts of you dedicated to vision, parts of you that regulate your breathing, parts of you that become more active when you are hungry and compel you to eat, parts of you that exert self-control to get you to go to the gym, and so on. As another example of modularity, when it comes to some kinds of decision making, you could think of different modules as having different discount rates. A discount rate refers to how much you're willing to put off getting something that you want now in order to get more of that something later. From an evolutionary perspective, the most adaptive discount rate for some valuable thing like food or a mating opportunity is going to depend on factors like how long you will live. If you will not live very long, then you should cash in, reap what you sow, collect the benefits now while you are alive. If you're long-lived, then it could make sense to delay gratification, wait until a future when you can get even more of the thing that you want. You can conceptualize different modules as having different discount rates, or another way of saying that, some modules are more patient than others. If you go to a party, you see some calorie-dense food, the kind of thing that would have been a boon for our ancestors. The part of you that is impatient may be relatively active, and you may be compelled to eat the cake or pizza or what have you. And there may be some other more patient part of you that has the long term in mind, which weighs the health and appearance consequences of eating that food, and that part of you may push you away from eating it. I think it is fine and good to conceptualize these different motivations within you as different modules that serve different functions, and they could come into conflict, and which one quote unquote wins depends on various contextual factors. So it's perfectly plausible that you want cake and you don't want cake, as both wants are part of you. It's worth saying that there is no command center. There is no module that is really truly you, and all the other parts are just feeding the real you information. You are just a collection of parts, none of which can you really justify as being the singular self who is in charge and makes decisions. There is this part of you that talks, a part of you that thinks in sentences. You can think of that as a module. It has a function, but it's just one of many parts. Another important idea necessary to understand the mind is encapsulation. Sometimes modules can be encapsulated from one another. This refers to the fact that modules only process certain inputs, they are only privy to certain bits of information, and sometimes information can't be shared across modules. When there is information within one module that can't be shared with another, those modules are said to be encapsulated with respect to one another. First, I'll give you an example of modules which are not encapsulated. Here we go. I can look at my computer screen. I can tell you I see an Apple logo. I could tell you my computer is silver colored. So in this case, there's light bouncing off the computer, enters my eye, light stimulates cells in my retina, information is sent to parts of my brain that process visual information. I have some conscious experience of seeing. There are other parts of me dedicated to speech. The modules that have to do with vision share that information with the modules that have to do with speech, allowing me to talk about what I see. So vision modules and speech modules are not typically encapsulated. The first example of encapsulation I'll talk about requires that I first talk a little bit about brain anatomy. The brain is divided into two hemispheres, left and right. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. When you move your right hand, your left hemisphere is responsible. When you move your left hand, your right hemisphere is responsible. This next bit I'm going to talk about is detailed. So if you are not paying attention, now would be the time to come back to Earth, because if you drift away, the rest won't make so much sense. So your visual field, what you see, is divided in two. If you look out straight ahead, everything that is to the left of what you are focusing on is your left visual field. Everything to the right of what you focus on is your right visual field. What you see in your left visual field is processed by the right side of the brain. And what you see in your right visual field is processed by the left side of the brain. And importantly, for most people, modules having to do with speech are located in the left hemisphere. Okay, there's only one more bit of brain anatomy I have to get to. There's a bundle of nerve fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres of the brain, known as the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum allows information to be shared across the two hemispheres. Okay, we are done with brain anatomy. Now on to my example of encapsulation. There are people referred to as split brain patients. These are typically people who suffer from seizures, and then as a last resort, they have their corpus callosum severed as a treatment. They are known as split brain in the sense that now their two hemispheres are largely disconnected. After their surgery, these patients were not noticeably different in terms of their personality or intelligence or emotions, but researchers discovered something very peculiar about their behavior, and we're going to talk about some experiments that have been done looking at these behavioral differences. Okay, in one experiment, a split brain patient was sat in front of a computer, instructed to look at a dot in the center of the screen. Then on the screen, words are flashed on the right side. So this is the patient's right visual field. The patient is asked, "What did you see?" The patient responds correctly. So the word tree is flashed in the right visual field. You ask the patient, "What did you see?" Patient says they saw the word tree. That is all well and good. Then they do another trial where they flash the word pan on the left side of the screen, the left visual field. Patient's asked, "What did you see?" And now the patient says, "I didn't see it." The patient can report on things flashed in the right visual field, but not the left. What's going on here is the left visual field is processed by the right hemisphere. Language is in the left hemisphere. And since these patients have a severed corpus callosum, the information cannot travel from right to left hemisphere. So when the patient is asked, "What did you see?" they can't say. They say they don't know what they saw. After the patient reports that they didn't see anything, the researcher gives them a marker and says, "Close your eyes and draw with your left hand what was on the screen." And in this case, the patient drew a picture of a pan. They were able to do this because the right side of the brain controls the left hand, and the right side does, quote unquote, know what was on the screen. The information about what was on the screen is in the right hemisphere, so that information can be used by right hemisphere modules, including those that control the left hand. So this is an example of somebody who can't say what they saw, but they can draw what they saw with their left hand. There's another trial where this patient is shown a picture of a saw on the left and a picture of a hammer on the right. So these are flashed very quickly while they're looking in the middle of the screen. Patient is asked, "What did you see?" Patient says that they saw a hammer. They then are asked to draw with their left hand what they saw, and they draw a saw. The patient is asked, "Why did you draw that?" And the patient says, "I don't know." And sometimes split brain patients confabulate. The part of them that talks doesn't know why they did what they did, so it makes up a reasonable sounding explanation. In one trial, a patient was shown a chicken claw in the right visual field and a wintry scene in their left visual field, like a snowy scene. They were then shown an array of cards with pictures on them and had to point to cards that were related to what they saw. And importantly, they pointed to one card with their left hand and one card with their right hand. With their left hand, they pointed to a snow shovel. That makes sense, since the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere saw the wintry scene. With their right hand, they pointed to a chicken. That makes sense, since the right hand is controlled by the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere saw a chicken claw. But when asked to explain why their hands were pointing at these pictures, the patient said, "Oh, that's simple. The chicken claw goes with the chicken, and you need a shovel to clean out the chicken shed." So the explanation produced by the left hemisphere only made reference to the chicken claw because that is all the left hemisphere saw. And the patient is confabulating. They are coming up with reasonable sounding explanations that they seemingly believe, but of course, it's not the real reason for their behavior. So here we have a case of encapsulation. The modules having to do with visual perception and speech are encapsulated from one another. They cannot share information, and this has particular behavioral effects. I'm going to talk about a few more examples of encapsulation to get across the value of thinking in this way. My next example is optical illusions, which is perhaps not a great choice for an audio medium, but I'm going to go for it anyway. Think about your favorite optical illusion. There are illusions where it seems like there's motion, even though there isn't. Illusions where lines appear to be slanted, even though they're straight. Where two patches of color look different, even though they're the same. The list goes on. The particular example I'll use is the Muller-Lyer illusion, in which two lines, which are the same length, appear to be different lengths. If you are so inclined, you can Google Muller-Lyer illusion and see what I'm talking about. So I'm looking at the illusion, and my eyes are telling me the lines are different. I take out my handy ruler, which I always have on me. I measure the lines, and according to the ruler, by God, the lines are exactly the same. After I measure the lines, in spite of being completely convinced that the lines are indeed the same length, it still looks like the lines are different. My perception remains unchanged. So I'm stuck in this weird contradiction where I have the knowledge of what is true, but I'm having a perception that contradicts that knowledge. I have information represented in different ways in different parts of myself. This is a case where my propositional knowledge about the lines being the same length can't affect my visual perception. Whatever modules correspond to my knowledge and my perception are encapsulated in this respect. It's not like once I learn that the lines are the same, all of a sudden I see them as the same. In this particular case, my knowledge does not affect my perception, and I'm just stuck with a discrepancy between what I see and what I believe. Another interesting example of encapsulation is blind sight. This occurs when people who are blind are still able to use visual information to make decisions and guide their behavior. It can occur in people who have damage to a part of their brain that processes visual information. Importantly, these people have no damage to their eyes. So light is still coming in from the world. It's being transduced. It's being transmitted to the brain. But due to the brain damage, the person has no conscious experience of sight. If you ask somebody with this kind of brain damage what they see, they will say they don't see anything. But experiments have been done that show that they are still using visual information in some instances. For example, in one study, blind people were presented with either an X or an O, and they were asked to guess which they were looking at. In spite of the fact that these people report being blind, some of them guess correctly at higher than chance levels. They go through many trials of these, and they're beating chance. There's various studies along these lines that use different methodologies. What's going on here is the brain is still receiving visual information. There are modules that can make some use of that information, even though the module in charge of vision is unable to produce a conscious experience. So these people can't see, but they can still make use of visual information. I have had an experience somewhat similar to blindsight. I was playing with this program that was meant to teach you things about sensation and perception, which is a field of psychology. And as a part of this, there's a section where a square would either flash on the screen or it wouldn't flash on the screen. And I have to push one button if I saw it flash and a different button if I didn't see it flash. So it's a test of sorts. And after each trial, I am told whether or not I was correct. At the beginning, the square's on the screen for long enough that it's very obvious. You can definitely tell whether a square flashed or did not flash. But as it goes on, the flashing becomes faster and faster. It eventually flashes so quickly that you can't tell whether anything was on the screen. Every trial just looks like a blank screen because even when the square flashes, it's so fast you can't consciously pick up on it. But even at this point, when it was going so quickly I couldn't see anything, I noticed I kept getting it right. It felt to me like a complete guess, but I would strangely get the right answer again and again. So this is a case where the part of my brain that produces the conscious experience of vision did not have access to whether or not something flashed on the screen, but there was some part of me that received visual information and was able to use that to guide my decisions. Another example of modularity and encapsulation comes from a study in which participants were shown 4 pairs of pantyhose laid out in a line, and they were asked to pick which one they liked best. The researchers did not tell participants that the pantyhose were actually all identical. Participants made their choices, and it was found that there was a strong affective position whereby participants were more likely to choose the pantyhose that were on the right. So going from left to right, 12% chose the first pair, 17% chose the second pair, 31% chose the third pair, and 40% chose the fourth pair. So there was some effective order, whereby participants were more likely to pick the pantyhose that they saw more recently. Why there was this order effect doesn't really matter for our purposes. Participants were asked after they made the choice why they chose the pantyhose they chose, and most of the subjects gave reasons that referred to features of the pantyhose like the weave, elasticity, and so on. They justified their choice by claiming that there was indeed some noticeable difference between the pantyhose. That is to say, they were not aware of why they made the choice that they did. The real reason they chose was because of some tendency to pick the pantyhose viewed more recently. No participants justified their choice by talking about the position of the pantyhose or the order in which they were viewed. When asked whether the position of the pantyhose could have affected their judgment, only one person out of 52 admitted that it could have been influential. This is a case where the module that talks, the part of the person that is consciously reflecting, does not have access to the reason why they made the decision that they made. There is some part within these participants that, for whatever reason, took order and position into account when making the decision, but the module that talks is unaware of this. And indeed, when the module that talks is forced to justify behavior for which it does not have access to, it sometimes confabulates and comes up with a reasonable sounding explanation. A similar kind of example comes from studies of choice blindness. I'll describe one study that was featured in a TED Talk. I'll put the link to the TED Talk in the show notes. In this study, participants were shown 2 pictures of faces and asked which one they found more attractive. They were then given the picture to inspect, the one that they picked, and asked why they preferred that face. In some instances, after the participant said which face they found more attractive, the researchers used sleight of hand to give the participant the face they did not choose. The researcher asked the participant, why did you choose that face? And what was found is that the vast majority of the time, participants were unaware that they had been given the face they didn't choose, and they sometimes go on to give a reasonable sounding explanation for their choice. In some cases, referencing features specific to the face that they were given that were not found in the face that they chose. So if they chose somebody with brown hair, they're given a picture of somebody with blonde hair, they're asked to justify why they picked that picture, and they say, oh, because I like blonde hair. This is another case of the module that talks not having access to the decision-making process. I'll talk about one more study consistent with this modular view. In this study, participants were presented with vignettes and asked to make a judgment. I'm going to start this by reading one of the vignettes, and then I'll talk about how the participants responded. Here is a vignette participants read. Julie and Mark, who are brother and sister, are traveling together in France. They are both on summer vacation from college. One night, they are staying alone in a cabin near the beach. They decide that it would be interesting and fun if they tried making love. At the very least, it would be a new experience for each of them. Julie was already taking birth control pills, but Mark uses a condom too, just to be safe. They both enjoy it, but they decide not to do it again. They keep that night as a special secret between them, which makes them feel even closer to each other. So what do you think about this? Was it wrong for them to have sex? Okay, I am no longer reading. Participants are being asked to make a moral judgment. The authors found that most participants say that it is wrong, that this incest case is wrong. After they give their judgment, the experimenter asks why they think it's wrong. And it's the experimenter's job to argue with the participant and push them to give a coherent answer. So here's a representation of what the conversation between the participant and the experimenter sounded like. The participant says it's wrong. The experimenter says why. The participant says something about how, inbreeding leads to children who are unhealthy. Then the experimenter points out that, they use 2 forms of birth control, so that's not really a big concern. The participant then says, it's going to hurt Mark and Julie. It's going to hurt the relationship that they have with each other. The experimenter says, it says right in the vignette that they enjoyed it and it made them feel closer to each other, so that doesn't sound like a strong reason for why it would be wrong. Then the participant says, but people will find out, it'll hurt the reputation. The experimenter says, right in the vignette, it says they kept it a secret. And finally, the participant says, it's just wrong. I can't explain it, it's just wrong. When asked to justify why the incest case is wrong, many participants first come up with a reason that makes reference to somebody being harmed. But after it's pointed out to them that this contradicts what's in the vignette, they end up saying it's wrong even though they can't explain why. This is a phenomenon known as moral dumbfounding. And this is another case where the module that talks knows not why a decision was made. When asked to justify their choice, participants seem to confabulate reasons that seem like they can't be the real reason for their choice because it's directly contradicted in the vignette. And they end up in a place where they've made a judgment and they have some certainty in that judgment, but the part of them that talks doesn't know why they have made that judgment. All right, I went through lots of examples that make sense given this modular view of the mind. I reckon in the next episode, I'll talk about what you can do with this knowledge, how you can apply it in a useful way. But for now, up next, expertise. In this segment, I'll talk about some real-world useful skill that doesn't just happen inside of your head. This episode, that skill is public speaking. I expect this to help people who do public speaking, but I think it can also help in related contexts like speaking up during a meeting, and there's some general communication stuff in here that I think will apply pretty generally. First, I'm going to talk about 2 basic principles, and then I'll go into specific bits of advice. First basic principle. It is a fact of psychology that we pay attention to people who are high status and communicate with a lot of certainty. This is at least in part because certainty is a costly signal of the validity of the information, which is an idea I'm not going to delve too deeply into now, but I might go into it in a future podcast. Much of good public speaking comes down to adopting the behaviors associated with high status and certainty. This does not mean that you should always have your confidence level turned up to 11, no matter the context. This is something I'm going to talk about later. Second basic principle. When you are speaking, you are in a competition. You are in a competition with whatever the audience can be doing aside from listening to you. Often, this might be ignoring you in favor of thinking about something. People often drift between paying attention and zoning out, thinking about something. Next time you watch somebody speak in public, notice how much you are paying attention and how much you are just inside your head thinking about things. Here is a simple model for how to think about whether somebody pays attention to you. The audience will quickly suss out what value they can get by listening. This can be humor, inspiration, important information, a compelling story, so on and so forth. And from this value, subtract how much effort it takes to pay attention to you. If you provide lots of value and it is easy to pay attention, people pay attention. If you do not provide lots of value and paying attention is effortful, people don't pay attention. Next, I'm going to go into specific bits of advice. I've numbered each bit just so that there's some sort of structure. Number 1, give eye contact to audience members. One trap people fall into is looking at only one half of the audience. So make sure that you look at the entire audience. Number 2, make sure you are loud enough so that everyone can hear you, and err on the side of being louder rather than quieter. It is fine and good to be a bit loud. 3, vocal variety. Change the volume of your voice throughout by getting louder in some parts and quieter in others. Also, change the pitch of your voice. Don't be monotone. Do as I say, not as I do. Number 4, as for speed, it is definitely more common to be too fast rather than too slow. One thing at play is nervousness tends to speed people up. I would say at least experiment with speaking more slowly. 5, use gestures. Use your body. Use your face. One bad habit is gesturing with only one hand. It often looks better to gesture with both hands. 6, filler words. Words like so, you know, and like. Most people could stand to reduce these. I don't think it's necessarily good to completely remove filler words. They do sometimes have a function aside from filling space when you don't know what to say. But many people have far too many. It's not that unusual for somebody to say once a sentence or more. That is way too often. Also, I think in general, it's better to not start off a sentence with a filler word. A common example is people will start their sentences with so. I have heard people begin speeches with so. Just cut out the so. Instead of saying, so today I'm going to talk about X, just say, today I'm going to talk about X. A lot of the time, a filler word is filling space between sentences or filling space while you're thinking about what to say next. If you're going to cut down on your filler words, what do you do with these spaces? Just let them be empty spaces, which is to say, pause. Don't be afraid to take pauses. How do you decrease filler words? Here are some things you can do. Next time you do public speaking, have somebody count how many filler words you use broken down by word. They can give you a report afterwards of how many times you said how many times you said no, how many times you said so on and so forth. This will be useful information about which words you use as a crutch. You can also, as an exercise, count the number of filler words somebody else is using. This can be useful for making yourself aware of filler words in speech. Another thing you can do, and I have done public speaking under these conditions, is to have a bell, preferably a bell that is not very loud, and somebody rings the bell every time you use a filler word. So you would, for example, give a speech, and every time you use a filler word, you would hear the bell ring. 7, give people a reason to pay attention when you begin speaking. You can do something attention-grabbing. You can pose a question and say you are going to answer it later so the audience stays with you because they want to know the answer. In general, give your audience right away evidence that they will get something valuable from listening to you, which includes being funny, inspirational, what have you. I am a psychology professor. One thing I'll do in my classes is before starting a lecture, I'll say something like, I just wanted to remind you guys that the exam is on such and such date. I find that if I say that, students will pay more attention during the lecture compared to if I don't say that. The reason being, I'm making them think about their grade in the class, which makes their motivation to do well in the class salient, which causes them to do things that will help them do well in the class, like pay attention. 8, it's often good to have some kind of structure in what you are saying. For example, notice that this segment has a structure. I had an introduction where I say what the segment is about. Within the segment, there are different parts that I give context for before going into them, and I make it clear when I'm moving on to the next chunk of information. If you don't have a structure, your audience can get lost and they don't know where you're going, which can make it more effortful to pay attention. The basic structure for essays that you learned in high school also works just fine for speeches. You have some opening that is hopefully attention grabbing. You make clear what the point of the speech is. You have the body of your speech where you clearly delineate when you've finished making one point and have moved on to the next, and then some conclusion. 9, there is something magical about stories. People love stories, and stories are really easy to pay attention to. Try incorporating stories if you can. 10, speeches that are written word for word often sound like they are written. In formal contexts, this is appropriate. There are times when you want to sound like what you are saying was written down ahead of time, but often you don't because speech and writing are not the same, and it's unnatural to speak the same way that you write. One method for having your public speaking sound natural is to not write down what you are going to say word for word ahead of time. Instead, make notes and then write the speech by talking through it. So you come with the notes and then you try to just give your speech out loud. So you give your speech to yourself, and that is how you write it, In that way, it will sound more like talking and less like the written word. 11. Within different communities, there are different norms of communication. For example, in science, you are not supposed to communicate your scientific findings with lots of confidence. You are supposed to present yourself as open to criticism. Also, at least in principle, it's good to flag when you are more or less certain of what you're saying. This is in stark contrast to, say, political speeches, where the norm is to always have your confidence turned up to 11, never admit that you're wrong, never admit to not knowing something. There is often the temptation to present yourself as more certain than you are because it's higher status. But of course, if you're trying to accurately convey your beliefs, you would want to fight this urge. Next, I'm going to talk about some don'ts, things to avoid doing while public speaking. For each don't, you should avoid it unless you are intentionally doing it. For example, if you are speaking while standing, don't cross your legs. That is, unless there is some reason why you're crossing your legs, like maybe if you're demonstrating something. But unless there's a specific reason, you should not cross your legs because it is a sign that you are nervous and uncomfortable. Other don'ts. Don't touch your face. Don't fidget. One thing I often see is if someone wears a ring, they play around with the ring as they're speaking. Don't pace around. Again, it's fine to move while speaking, but there should be some purpose to your movement, not just something you're doing nervously. If you're standing, don't shift your weight back and forth. Stand up straight. Don't put your weight on one leg and then on the other, back and forth. Likewise, don't bounce around. Just stand with your feet planted on the floor. In general, don't read aloud unless you have a particular reason to do so. There's something about reading out loud that makes it hard to pay attention to. Of course, it makes sense to read sometimes, but generally avoid it if you can. Next, I'll talk about some particular strategies for improving your public speaking. If you want to get better at public speaking, my number one recommendation is to join Toastmasters. Toastmasters is an organization dedicated to improving public speaking. They have clubs all around the world. At a Toastmasters meeting, members will give speeches. Those speeches will be evaluated so that speakers learn what they did well and what they can improve on. And there's a section dedicated to impromptu speaking. It gives you a way to practice with very low stakes and you get feedback. Most clubs meet once a week for an hour. It costs about $50 every 6 months. You can observe meetings for free, and if you go to a meeting, you are under no obligation to speak. If you just Google, find a Toastmasters, there's a good chance you can find clubs near you. Another thing you can do is record yourself. You can take a video of yourself giving a presentation, and when you watch it, you will likely notice things that can be improved. And finally, you can practice speaking at open mics. If you have any interest in trying stand-up comedy, you can do that at an open mic. If you write poetry, you can read it. If you write fiction, you can read your fiction. Anything where you are speaking to an audience can help, especially if you aren't very experienced. That's it for public speaking advice. Let's move on to Check This Rec. In this segment, I recommend some bit of media that you are perhaps unfamiliar with. This episode's rec is a website, and that website is bloggingheads.tv. Blogging Heads is a video blog site which has mostly conversations between two people. It has been around for a long time. The archives go back to 2005. Nowadays, it's largely political blah blah, but there are a bunch of conversations on there between scientists and philosophers. To throw out a few names you are likely familiar with, Blogging Heads has conversations with Eliezer Yudkowsky, Robin Hanson, Tyler Cowen, Peter Singer, and plenty of other interesting people. So if you have a sec, check this rec. That's it for this episode. The sources that I've referred to throughout the episode, including this week's rec, can be found in the show notes. Now go forth and make history.